It was a rather stunning tour of the Clyfford Still Museum in Denver, Colorado, July 2, 2026. Museum Director Joyce Tsai spoke without notes on many subjects, and I listened through the lens of my own Institute Residency task, that being still in Cascadia, or how the abstract expressionist legend Clyfford Still's time in Cascadia shaped his life, his art, and his cosmology. Joyce Tsai is an award-winning educator and scholar whose research receives support with fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation, Dedalus Foundation, Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, and the Phillips Collection, among others. She's published extensively in the field of technical art history with conservators and conservation scientists at the National Gallery of Art, Harvard Art Museums, Guggenheim, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Formerly the chief curator at the University of Iowa's Stanley Museum of Art, and Associate Professor of Practice at the School of Art and Art History. She's been director of the Clyfford Still Museum since 2021 and is our guest to discuss the museum, the artist, and maybe even what it is about Cascadia that made Clyfford Clyfford for good and bad. Joyce, I'm grateful for your time today and especially for this experience.
I'm delighted to have you. It really is an honor to have your voice as part of the Institute and the institution. So thank you for doing the work.
My pleasure. Is this the coolest background ever? This
Concrete,
wall?
poured concrete. So
And this is, Brad Clopefil, was he the
yes,
architect? Was this his
yes, Brad
idea to do
Cloteful,
these ridges?
absolutely. So it's Brad Cloteful is the architect of Allied Works. And it really has so many incredibly kind of innovative details in this building. The museum opened in 2011. It's a extraordinary kind of architectural gem. But what I find really moving about this building is that, oftentimes when you think of museum buildings that have been kind of launched in the last 15 or 20 years, they sometimes feel like incredibly powerful works of sculpture. And sometimes the work kind of stands in tension with the architecture. But in the case of this building in particular, I can't think of another building where the artwork itself and the architecture are in such beautiful kind of yeah, so beautifully aligned. The kind of vertical fins that you see behind you, and that the fact that you can actually see the wood grain, pressed against that concrete really lends this kind of incredible texture throughout the museum, but the upright sort of fins, those lines also echo so much of the features that you see in Still's paintings. So it's unusual, but it's really exquisite.
It is exquisite. I agree. How did you come to take the job as director of the Clyfford Still Museum?
So I was lucky enough to have been recruited for the position. I was chief curator of the Stanley Museum of Art at the time, and I was very happy there. It was an incredible institution. I'm very much a kind of committed professor, educator. And that collection included Jackson Pollock's mural, an extraordinary, Beckmann triptych that the university had bought in the 1940s, and it was just an incredible opportunity. But I have to admit, when they invited me to the in-person part of the interview, and I stepped foot in the building, and especially when they opened the doors to art storage, and I saw rack upon rack of beautiful paintings, I actually squealed like a stuck pig. It was very undignified. But it was one of the most amazing experiences because, I have worked in museums. I was lucky to have been at the National Gallery early in my career and in my fellowship at the Phillips Collection, but I've never seen, art storage quite that exquisite before. But the fact that you could see the collection itself, held in this back corridor, encased in glass so you can actually see inside. It was stunning. But it wasn't until I took the job and I started thinking about what this institution means, that it occurred to me that having the collection held in these kind of glass vaults where you can see in, how important that was. Because, you know, for those who don't know the story of Clyfford Still and the story of the museum, Clyfford Still is this extraordinary American abstract expressionist painter. He doesn't come from money. He was born in North Dakota. He and his family are farmers, and they actually moved to the wilds of Southwest Canada, where they were farmers, and from there he went down to Washington State to get his education. So he earned his BA from Spokane and then his graduate degree in painting, his master's in painting from Washington State College, now Washington State University in Pullman. And that's his background, that's his training. He doesn't come from the art world, he doesn't come from money, he doesn't come from privilege. He's not an insider. But he was after he got his degree at Washington State College, he became a professor there. In 41, he left that position. He went on to another teaching position in Richmond Polytechnic, which later became VCU. And then, he spent time really kind of getting to know the New York art scene. It was friends with Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock. And he was also appointed the first chair of painting at the San Francisco Art Institute, which was then called California Fine Arts. So again, chair of painting. So, by the 1950s, he had already established quite a reputation for himself. And he was represented by, the kind of legendary gallerist, Betty Parsons, who represented him, Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman. And the four of them really transformed the kind of American art scene. But Still himself was not interested in, the kind of speculative nature of the art market. He had no interest in, preserving the kind of exclusionary practices that you might find in certain art circles. And so he actually pulled out of what was a very fruitful relationship with his gallerist and decided to represent his own interest, and also only would show with museums when they conformed to his expectations. And so MoMA wanted to show his work. He refused as part of a, group exhibition, 15 American painters, and he, you know, decided that he didn't want to participate. And finally, after several rounds of correspondence, Dorothy Miller finally agreed to allow him to show his work in his own gallery. So this is the kind of person Still was. And he basically, you know, refused to compromise. His gallerist asked him in 1955, if you're not doing this for fame and fortune, what are you doing this for? To which he responded that his ambition was to make paintings become the living instruments of our revelation and freedom. That last bit is a direct quote from his correspondences. It comes up in actually several places. And you don't make paintings the way that Still does. Enormous, canvases that are really scaled for public consumption, not for private contemplation. If you were doing this just for yourself, right? And he ended up holding on to 93% of everything he ever made. And when he died, he entrusted all of it in his will to an unnamed American city, an unnamed American city willing to build him permanent quarters to show research and kind of conserve his work. And what's remarkable about this story is that a lot of different cities and institutions vied for this collection. Still died, between when he died and when this institution came in being, there was an interval of over 20 years. And it's extraordinary that, an artist would hold on to everything, 93% of everything they ever made. Um, and that there was a city that's kind of daring enough to agree to his terms, you know. If you think that the terms that he set for MoMA were stringent, the terms that he set for the city that was willing to, accept the gift were, I think, even more challenging, This is an institution that can only show his work. And this is the kind of permanent home for this extraordinary collection, but that also just means that the collection is never really going to grow or shrink. I think for most people, the idea of running a single artist museum where you can only show the work of Clyfford Still might seem, potentially monotonous. But for me, I actually think all of these constraints are actually the source of our strength in a paradoxical way. We have had to be very creative about how we open this institution up to others. And, I see it as my duty to not just run a kind of sterile temple, which, by the way, is how Clifford Still described museums in published writings. Um, I think it's much more important to pay attention to this idea of creating a space where his paintings can actually become the living instruments of our revelation and freedom, that the gift to a city can actually be a gift to a city, to a community, that it can, allow us to see possibilities that we couldn't have envisioned without the aid and the guidance of, truly transformative and a kind of renegade visions that he is able to afford us. So, yeah, that's a very long and roundabout way to answer the
Well,
question of how did I end up here?
you covered a lot of ground that is, I think, important. Your squeal moment before you accepted the
Yeah,
job here, since we have Zoom, I can share screen, and since I've been taking a lot of pictures, I can give people a sense of what it is you're
yeah,
talking about.
yeah,
So
yeah,
these are rails, if you can see in the bottom
yeah,
there, and they're pulled out. And then, of course, I went in deeper to get a little more detail on some of the photos. We see the lifeline there and there,
yep,
or what could be construed as that if and I think we'll talk about that. And then going through chronologically some of the earlier stuff, some of the stuff that was representational but beginning to swerve into abstraction,
yep,
that more represent. Oh, this done at Yaddo on window shades,
yep,
actually. Yeah,
yep,
he was so poor he couldn't really afford proper canvas, so he was painting on window shades. And then, anyway, but just rack after rack after rack of work that is available, especially to someone like myself doing a residency. And this is part of what we have access to. You can see the many different doors or racks, if you will. And then, and it just goes on and on. And this is only one of the rooms, and we haven't even gotten through a third of the racks in that. Oh, and this, of course, is the other room. So you can see, and we get up there and get the texture and so on and so forth. But that's what was what provided your squeal moment, that
I mean,
particular.
it's hard not to squeal in front of that, I think.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I mean, not just moments of squealing, but also moments of such joy
Yeah,
that you find yourself breaking down.
yeah, yeah,
Potent stuff. Um, you were mentioning that in Clifford Still's will that he would donate all the holdings of his work to an American city that will create a building for the ongoing um, exhibition and study of
Hmm.
his work. And
Yep.
so the Institute can be seen as fulfilling that part of the demand or the stipulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's exactly how I see it. And I also see it kind of as the kind of research and development arm of the museum. Um, I am a recovering academic, and so I was a professor at the University of Iowa, but I was also a professor at the University of Florida. And I think there are a lot of challenges that universities face right now. I think in part because of the different kind of funding models that have come into being, it's actually getting harder, not easier, to do truly interdisciplinary work. And I run a single artist museum, but his paintings are so extraordinary, that I think it can really sustain so many different perspectives. I think that's something that's really important. And I felt like it was really important to bring people, if we're not going to be able to kind of, send things out, bringing people in, is really going to be important. And also, in a kind of ongoing way, if Still's ambition is to make his paintings be living instruments of revelation and freedom, I'm just going to keep saying that over and over again because I take it very seriously. Um, then it's going to be really important for us to bring in people who can show us the range of things that these instruments can be used to play and to make and to envision and be able to forge kind of paths that we couldn't have possibly imagined. And the Institute also draws strength from the fact that if you look at Still's career, the moments where he had residencies were the moments where you can see this profound acceleration of his kind of growth and development, the summer after he finished grad school at Washington State College, he was extended an invitation to go and be in residence at Yaddo. And Yaddo is this renowned residency program that brings artists, intellectuals, writers together on this beautiful estate in upstate New York, in Saratoga Springs, where they would get housing and they would get meals, but they're not provided with their materials. And so, still, as a freshly minted grad student from a farming family, you know, he would pack up his car and would bring his paints and his, rolled up window shades to paint on and would spend, his time at the residency making these kind of smaller sketches. They're not from life. They are, kind of fantastic. And some of these sketches became larger paintings, and some of these larger paintings became etchings. So these were, and it also allowed him to kind of explore all sorts of different motifs. Um, he did that for 2 summers basically in a row. And I think that really set the stage for the kind of um, incredibly unusual moves that he would make as an artist that would, by the time he kind of starts showing in the 1940s, he gets recognition for being almost frighteningly original. So again, I mean, we take inspiration from the fact that Still himself benefited from these residencies, and we've also really benefited enormously from Deborah Buck, who's an artist and also a philanthropist, and she actually knew Clyfford Still. And Clyfford Still was actually the person who sent her on her first residential fellowship experience for the very first time at Skowhegan. And so not only did Still benefit from that experience, but he also paid it forward and invested in younger artists, which is also exactly what Deborah Buck is doing now, investing in the Institute Residential Fellowship Program. Um, and, from my own perspective, I too have benefited from, residential fellowship programs. I was lucky enough to be at the National Gallery at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts when I was finishing my dissertation and just being in conversation with senior scholars, curators, conservators in lots of different fields really opened up my kind of perspectives on what was possible to write, to think, to do. But, you know, almost as important, or perhaps even more importantly, it taught me what fellowship means, to be in fellowship with others. There is a kind of thought that's only possible when you are, caught in the conviviality of a moment, of breaking bread together. There's a really beautiful moment in Virginia Woolf's Room of One's Own, where she's describing a kind of incredibly convivial meal in the men's college, that ends with, the description of the way that glass of claret burns at the base of your spine and how that, offers you the kind of sustenance for thought. And those are all things that are really important to me. And in the context of the Clyfford Still Museum, we wanted to bring in kind of renegade thinkers, in the vein of Still as kind of as a model. And so we've brought in, artists. We've brought in you, Paul, a poet, and also economists, experts in early childhood. These are all kind of areas of study and exploration that the museum is embarking on or has been embarking on. And again, we benefit enormously from this kind of infusion of new approaches each time we have a class in. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It answered the next question too.
Oh, okay.
The one I was going to have after that. I wanted to get some sense of the breadth and depth of the fellowships and the areas of study, and I think you handled it pretty well. And of course, information is available on the website. They can just go to the Institute section and see some of the presentations that were made. I watched Michael Holloman's after I made my proposal, and it was very helpful. And then I had a chance to interview Michael as part of my own residency fellowship. So yeah, it was absolutely spot on. One of the notes I made from your July 2nd talk, and I think I've heard you talk about this a couple of times now, is Still's education, the arts component, and the fact that it was a public education, which
Yep.
seems to be very important to you. Can you explain why?
Yeah. It's important to me for all sorts of reasons. I, again, having been a professor at two amazing public flagship universities, I have seen firsthand how transformative they are for its students. But in terms of the kind of specificity of, American art, I mean, we think about abstract expressionism as a movement of, extraordinary individuals, individuals that seem to have kind of arrived from nowhere, kind of, like Athena, born fully formed out of the head of Zeus or something. Um, there's a kind of mythical quality to it. But when we actually look at where each of these artists come from, public support is a very important part of that story. And the United States invested in public education um, in a couple of really crucial moments. And, really beginning in the teens, but also with a kind of concerted policy investment in the 20s and into the 30s. Arts education was elevated as a kind of, part of the strategy to improve education across the board to produce citizens and workers that could be resilient and kind of responsive to the biggest challenges of modernity. We have to remember that, after the First World War, and, in the 1920s, we saw a period of profound technological change. You saw, new developments in media, and, with the Great Depression, I think, and also when you start looking at the 1930s, there are a lot of questions about the kind of viability of democracy. It was under pressure both domestically and also abroad during this period. And so, you know, thinkers and, people like John Dewey and, private foundations like the Carnegie Corporation, but also state and federal governments really developed this kind of concerted kind of policy of um, investing in arts education, which also means investing in arts infrastructure to, again, create the conditions where, being trained in art actually allows you to be more creative, to think independently, and to allow you to kind of operate in a way that allows you to be kind of inoculated against, forms of authoritarianism. So these were all the big stakes, you know. And what I find extraordinary is that in the 1930s, against the backdrop of economic crisis, huge geopolitical kind of international geopolitical pressures and crises, and also in the midst of an ecological crisis. Let's not forget that this is also the period of the Dust Bowl. Um, we had philanthropies in the government invest in building out an arts campus, and I'll take the University of Iowa as an example. It was, a state university, and the investment in art education and arts kind of infrastructure happened there because they were the ones who were teaching and training the teachers, right? And you can't teach and train teachers in art education if you don't have working artists doing the teaching. And you can't do that kind of teaching without the proper resources, the equipment, the infrastructure. You can't teach printmaking without a press, and those things, weigh like thousands of pounds. You cannot do sculpture without, the adequate kind of, equipment and also the tools to, do that kind of work. You cannot teach theater without a theater, and all of that had to be built. That requires an investment. And in the case of Clifford Still teaching in Washington State College, he was kind of part of that entire kind of sea change of, again, kind of teaching art within the context of a university. And that is very different than teaching art within in a context of a kind of academy or a kind of fine arts kind of institution, where the emphasis would be all about emulating a particular master, emulating the artist that came before you. Um, Still did some of that, but he also took courses in philosophy and sociology and, history and literature and all sorts of other things. And he was very much an intellectual, you can tell in part by looking at his books, and there's all sorts of little marginalia that he is scribbling away. And we have a copy of his, On the Sublime by Longinus. And you see in the margin notes little kind of annotations, little bits of Greek here and there, as one does. And it's clear that he's thinking through all sorts of stuff, And it was at Washington State College that, he was being trained to be a painter. But just as importantly, he was being trained as an artist who can teach. And as part of his teaching fellowship, he would like teach, 10 classes in drawing. He was incredibly active. Like you can see in his notes, you can see these kind of all of these little kind of cards that he did, like anatomical drawing cards, preparing himself, learning the human anatomy, but also learning it so that he can teach it. Um, but it was such a kind of like broad-based kind of education. But I also do think that when you are being trained as an artist, but also trained as an artist who can and must think, and also can and must think about the world around him. And you can also see that in his paintings from the 1930s. Um, I think that creates a very different kind of artist. And if you look at the other abstract expressionists, several of them also went through the WPA, and we're making huge murals with explicit kind of public and civic and social ambitions. And again, I do think that it's in this period of crisis that you see American artists really coming to the fore, trying to kind of make a case for the specific strengths of what it means to be an American, and what it looks like to engage with the kind of most challenging questions of the day. Um, and to be doing that in the context of a kind of in the context of a university, I think is really unusual, and also I think accounts for um, the extraordinary originality of Still's work, but also its kind of ethical commitments, if that makes sense.
Yes, I've been to the museum, I think 3 times before this residency, and I don't know how I missed it, but and it I'm, just hosting a podcast like this. I get many chances to display my own ignorance. One of them, though, is about this product that's used to treat canvases so that the linseed oil, the acid in the linseed oil doesn't eat through the canvas. And this is a thing, and I have a picture of it called rabbit skin glue. And and there it is, and I got a picture of it, and from what I understand, it doesn't smell very good, which you can imagine because its essential ingredient is rabbit collagen. And when I finally realized what was happening here, I had to tell my wife about it because she's a rabbit person, and so we've had rabbits in the house, and so we haven't told Bugs yet about this practice of rabbit skin glue being used, but and of course I've done a little research about it. It goes back to the Renaissance, and it's been used. But um, my wife wanted to know if surely they use rabbits who died from roadkill, which I don't think is true. And secondly, isn't there anything else that can be used? Can you talk a little bit about all this?
Right. I mean, it's still used. I mean, like it's I'm sure there are also alternatives, and there's also if you're working in acrylic, you don't have to do that. It is really specific to protecting the canvas from, how you do oil painting. I mean, in the simplest terms, just imagine a dish rag that you have at home, and you have something really oily and you're applying it to that dish rag. What's that going to look like? When you put it on, it's just going to soak in. It's just going to be a mess. And so the rabbit skin glue is there to really seal up all of the kind of, like, if you think about it as like pores, to kind of seal up all of the kind of warp and we like the surface of the canvas, make it impermeable, but also make it stiff, and also to tighten it, as it dries, it kind of tightens around the canvas. So it just really makes the canvas support that can kind of resist the pressure of the brush, or in the case of Clifford Still, the pressure of his trowel. And it's something that I find really interesting. In Still's paintings, there are several of his paintings in the museum where he doesn't like in a kind of traditional painting, you would start with canvas, you would cover it with the rabbit skin glue, and then sometimes you would apply like a kind of underlayer, like a layer of gesso. And that's really to kind of suppress the kind of presence of the texture of the canvas, so you have like this even smoother kind of surface to be working on. But Still did not do that. He just kind of like did the rabbit skin glue and then would start painting. And at a very early moment, he actually allows the exposed canvas to be the ground of his painting. So you could actually see the canvas. It's really quite beautiful. Um,
Last
I think
night's painting was an example of that.
the what? Last night's painting, yeah, absolutely. And I love those paintings. They're exquisite. But if you think about how, and this is a painting that's like, I don't know, like maybe 9 or 10 feet tall. It's a very big painting. But just imagine yourself. So this is a painting that like from 1953, he's in New York City. He's working in a studio in New York City. Those our friends in New York can tell you that there's not a lot of space. But you got to haul the wood up the stairs or wherever, and then you have to, secure this huge canvas, and then you tack it on, and then you do this rabbit skin glue thing. And so what you would do is you would soak it and you would dilute it, and then you would apply it to the surface. And there are friends of mine who are, who are painters, and they talk about how preparing the canvas, and especially the step where, your arm is kind of like sweeping across the canvas, applying it with, kind of like a mop almost. Um, that this is a step that also lets you get a sense of the dimension of the painting, the resistance of the canvas. And it's that first step that gets you kind of close to, again, this kind of ground. And what I find amazing is that in 53, already in 53, still has the kind of confidence to allow ultimately three colors and really kind of like three, maybe four campaigns of paint to be enough um, to allow this work to cohere as a painting, I think it takes a lot of experience and moxie to get to a point where you're willing to just kind of like let it go. But the rabbit skin glue bit is so interesting to me because we think of abstract expressionism again as a thing that it's just fast, spontaneous, gestural kind of works of genius. But that first crucial step that not all abstract expressionists are taking. I mean, for example, it's so famously, what do you call it? Helen Frankenthaler, she is just letting things soak into the canvas. That's just, something that she's doing. And Jackson Pollock is experimenting with all sorts of different kinds of paints, like commercial enamel paints, house paints. Um, so not all of these artists are doing this, but like in the case of Still, when you can see the canvas, and especially, and this is where I would really invite you all to come to the museum, when you can see the canvas and from a slightly, you know, from a angle on the side, and you look up at the painting, you can kind of see when you're looking at it frontally, like the rabbit skin glue, you don't think about it. You just imagine that you're seeing the canvas. But when you kind of look at it from the side, the light catches some of the activity of the hand. And you can see in some paintings, it's more rhythmic. In other paintings, it's more harried. Um, and there is something about it in some of his most exquisite works, I think, where you can really imagine what I would describe as like the quiet, contemplative care that's lavished on a surface that you don't think of. It lends the picture a different sense of time, pace, speed. Um, and it's a reminder that like great things, beautiful things are always um, the product of a lot of invisible work, invisible labor, and oftentimes the most spontaneous, free, joyful kind of expressions that you see still make. They oftentimes come at the end of his career, and you really kind of discover, because you're working in a single artist museum, that that kind of ebullient vision, that kind of joy is a kind of stringent joy. That it's a joy that's earned through a lifetime of work, of methodical kind of experimentation, of the things that have been, difficult, but they've all been metabolized, um, so that those later moments can come into being. Um, but I just really love the way that the light can sometimes give you a hint as to, you know, the way in which that preparation unfolded. So,
And you look at that painting, which two people had seen before, and
yeah,
before the conservator, just a
yeah.
tube that was unrolled. Hey, let's see what this one has. You
Hmm.
unroll it, you decide this is going to be next. You're doing a series of one painting a month for 15 months to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the
Yeah.
museum being open. And you open it up and you tell everybody, okay, we're unveiling PH 882. Drum roll, please.
Yeah.
Um,
Evocative.
No, yeah, exactly. Now, Andre Breton did not like that. He wanted some clues as to understand what the hell Still was doing. So there's a great story from the
Yeah.
archives, from the
Yeah.
journal, that Andre Breton needed a little more to go on and was speaking in French. And so he politely stepped out of Still's studio and never came back again. Um,
Right.
but maybe give us a little bit about why Still said, I'm not going to name these things anymore. I don't want to give you any clues. You should come up with your own ideas as to what it's about.
Yeah. I mean, a lot rides on a title, you know. We make we assume that a title is gives us a hint as to the deep abiding meaning to a work of art, as if there is only one. Um, and still didn't like that. Like, um, and I'll give you like a very evocative episode, where his, friend Jackson Pollock at one point had this amazing painting. It's now at the Met. He presented it to, I believe it was Sweeney, the curator, Sweeney and Peggy Guggenheim, and introduced this painting as Moby Dick. Moby Dick had this huge revival, in the first half of the 20th century. And Peggy Guggenheim wrinkled her nose and didn't think that that was, frankly, fancy enough, I guess. And so they came up with Pasiphae. Who the hell is Pasiphae? You know? And again, it's like this recourse to mythology and allegory, again, to kind of like lend depth of meaning and sophistication to a work of art that only a handful of insiders and, you know, Latin school kids and, um, the kind of educated elites who had access to this kind of knowledge would know about. This is not the kind of world that Still was particularly invested in. And the gesture of not titling, I think, can be read all sorts of different ways. It gives us license to kind of interpret it however we want. But I think there's also a kind of more um, rigorous demand that he is making of us by not giving us titles. Um, when people ask him what his paintings mean, he immediately flips the question around and asks the person what they think. And he never confirms or denies, but leaves you with this, let's face it, when you go into a museum and you're confronted with something that is puzzling, where you don't know anything about it, it can feel very destabilizing to, be put in a position to say something about it. But it's exactly that kind of, willingness to risk, the willingness to share, the willingness to also receive what the painting is giving, you know, and not just actually, use a painting as the kind of scrim against which you project all of your, unfettered desires or anxieties or whatever, but actually attend to what the painting is asking of you. Um, I think those are all of the things that Still is demanding of us, and something that I think is gives us an opportunity to be open to something that is strange, something that is overpowering, something that is awful, you know, like it can be any of those things. But again, I think he wants honesty, he wants courage, he wants independence, he wants revelation, he wants freedom, he wants all of that. And titles serve as straitjackets. They serve as blockades, they serve as constraints and restrictions. And so I think Still is also asking of us, do we dare to be free? You know? And I think that's a very serious question. It's a question that we also have been exploring in all sorts of ways. And what we've found, somewhat surprisingly, we had an exhibition that was co-curated by children. And since that exhibition in 2021, no, 22, we have included children's perspectives on the wall in all of our exhibitions. And in visitor surveys, we've found consistently that before we had done that, one of the biggest complaints that we got from our audiences was that I don't feel comfortable with abstraction. And so, it's off-putting because it seems like the kind of thing that you need to have a PhD to understand. But when you have the perspectives of children and when the institution actually values their perspectives enough so that, their voices gets designed up and applied as exquisite vinyls on the wall, you know, just like everybody else's, the expert's perspective. What we have found is that adults with or without children actually feel a lot more confident about their ability to engage with this material. This is not an instance of dumbing down. I think this is an instance of um, really kind of relishing the permission that children's joy give us to actually acknowledge that we do have what it takes to receive the kind of wisdom, joy, or um, kind of
Openness.
openness, and that his paintings might offer us.
There are two thoughts that come from that. First, in the archives I read, that Clyfford Still would rather learn, he'd rather know what a child thinks of his work than Clement
Yeah.
Greenberg. That was one thing. And then the second thing that came up, which hasn't come up, um, which I'm kind of surprised for me, that the Keats notion of negative capability, it
Hmm.
really comes into play here. That ability for a human being to stand in the midst of doubts, mysteries, doubts, and uncertainties without any irritable reaching after fact or reason. And
Hmm.
so, um, putting someone in a state, in an uncomfortable state, disequilibrium, is an opportunity for the process of that chaos to result in a more developed, an entity that's closer to individuation than
Sure.
it would have been without that. So
Yeah,
still here is he's a change agent in this.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think I think maybe the reason why it hasn't come up is because I'm trained as a Germanist. And so, like, all of my points of reference are ultimately German, in all sorts of ways. And what I've found that's been really curious is that, since becoming director of this museum, I've actually found that the kind of philosophical ideas that I had always been obsessed with and interested in, actually can find fruition, in practice. And, I think one of the things that I've always kind of intuitively believed is that the work of art offer us an opportunity to, get used to comportments, habits that are important to the functioning of, a kind of civic space, um, of learning how we can agree, and disagree and negotiate our differences and our experiences, and to share the ways in which we, um, are disturbed by or derive joy from a particular experience. Those are all things that we can do in front of a painting, and that painting becomes the kind of shared reality that we can always refer to. So that, and again, I actually think it's really important. I am not a kind of you're okay, I'm okay, kind of everybody's opinion, are the same or whatever. I do think that we can have differences of opinion and perspective that has to be anchored at all times in a shared reality. And when there's a painting in front of us, when there's an abstract painting in front of us, whether there's an abstract painting in front of us without a title, um, I think it opens us up to all sorts of different ways of, getting close to something like meaning, you know, and recognizing that meaning is never fixed, that meaning, but just because meaning isn't fixed doesn't mean that it is unmoored, you know, but that a painting, something in reality can be capacious enough to invite us all in, that it could be capacious enough to yield, lots of different interpretations. I think all of that's really important, but I also think that stills paintings, because they are so ambitious and so puzzling and so, um yeah, kind of miraculous, that, I go back to this idea that Theodore Adorno talks about, um in at different parts of his writing, where he, describes the kind of proper comportment to the other. And at other points, he talks about it as the proper comportment to a work of art, as one of kind of getting close to, and the word he uses is Anschmiegung ans andere, or a kind of snuggling up to the other, where it's not a kind of projection, it's not kind of a kind of, you know, you're not trying to absorb it. You're not trying to become it. You're not trying to kind of negate it. It is just this recognition that what you are contemplating, what you are, drawn to is not you, you know, does not share your experience, does not share your worldview, it doesn't share anything, but and yet there is a possibility of getting close to it. And I think that's one of the things that I love about this collection in this museum is that we have works that are strong enough to sustain all of these different kind of modes of inquiry. Um, and I do think that it gives us the space to get close to these works, but also to each other, and allows us to kind of imagine what it might be like for us to forge a new kind of civic reality.
What a great note to end on.
Well, it's a real pleasure chatting with you today.
I'm so grateful for your time. I'm so grateful for this experience. This is the most generative experience I've ever had in my life.
Oh, wonderful.
And I find myself in a mild, ecstatic state most of my waking moments. Thank you.
Well, that's delightful to hear. I mean, it really has been such an honor to have you here with us, and we so look forward to the work that you will produce.
Thanks, Joyce. Joyce Tsai, director of the Clyfford Still Museum in Denver, Colorado.
Thank you.